So we had the BC Liberal government get elected in 2001, and one of the first things they did is they tried to take away our right to strike by making education an essential service. And we were upset about that, but the real upset came about 6 months later when in the legislature they put forward legislation that, amongst other things, in the case of teachers, basically stripped from their agreement provisions that dealt with class size and composition, provisions for specialist teachers, very, very serious terms and conditions of employment that had a great impact on teacher workload, but also a great impact on student learning. And teachers were absolutely outraged. And I think it would be good to hear from you, because you were president at the time, exactly what you felt when that happened and how you reacted to what was going on.
Well, how I felt. I can tell you that it was a time of tremendous stress, but the stress exhibited itself maybe in some surprising ways. We knew, because they almost said it, and we knew because of what was happening at the bargaining table, and we knew because of rumors that the government was set on removing class size, composition, specialist teacher guarantees from the collective agreement. They wanted and they argued that these were public policy issues and they weren't issues that should be negotiated at bargaining tables. And they weren't being cute about it. They were pretty clear that that's what they wanted. They talked about that at the bargaining table. Because we were negotiating a collective agreement at the time, or trying to negotiate a collective agreement at the time. So when in the third week of January of 2002, the legislation was clearly imminent, I have to say that that wasn't the darkest time for me. What's interesting from my point of view, at least, and maybe for others, what happened during that week. You'll remember, because I told you right away, you were there. During that week, I got a call as president of the Federation from somebody in the Labor Department. I can't remember who it was, to be frank. It might have been Lee Doney, it might have been somebody else. I think it was somebody else. And that person said to me, well, if the teachers would agree to taking class size and composition and guarantees of specialist teachers out of the collective agreement, I'm pretty sure that we could find a little bit of extra money for them in salary. And I said, we can't do that. And the conversation ended fairly abruptly, and I hung up the phone, and then I thought, geez, I better be sure about this. This is really important stuff. I'd better make sure that that's really what he said. So I phoned Steve Kelleher, who was at the time the facilitator or mediator or something in the dispute. And I said, just what I said a minute ago. I said, look, I got this call from this guy. He says this, but we need to be 100% sure that that's in fact what they're saying, because this is incredibly important. Would you phone him? And he said yes, he would phone him. The next morning he called back and he said, you had it right. That's what they're saying. And I said to Kelleher, well, we can't agree to that. And he said, interestingly, I've always been interested that he said this. I said, we can't agree to that. He said, no, you can't. Now, I don't know why he said that, because he believed that, because that's what you say to, maybe he was trying to encourage me to continue the conversation and he was looking for some middle. I said, we can't do that. He said, no, you can't. And that was the end of that conversation. And then that Thursday night, overnight, the Liberals brought, remember, the Liberals, this is the days of 77-2 in the legislature, right? There were only 2 opposition members of the legislature. And the Liberals brought in bills 27 and 28 and passed them overnight on the night of Thursday, the 24th or whatever it was of January. And now you're asking me how I felt. I'll tell you what the worst moment was for me. While all this was happening at the bargaining table, we were in the labor board arguing about essential services, because we had an action plan that included political, what some people called strikes, what we called political action. And in fact, it wasn't theoretical anymore, because we called a one-day stoppage of work for that Monday, the 28th of January. So there was this fraught and very stressful hearing at the labor board that was going on all along, all that weekend into the weekend. That weekend, we were at the labor board the whole time. I don't think you were there because you do other work. You were busy with other stuff that weekend. And I was there at the labor board with the lawyers and the whole 9 yards, and they were arguing that this Monday thing that we were going to do was going to be an illegal strike. And at the very same time, Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark were on the media saying this is going to be illegal, and, you know, they could be fined, they could be fired, da-da-da-da. And that Sunday night, the arguments were still happening at the labor board. And it came to after dinner time, and whoever was there said, you better go home because tomorrow's a big day. You got other stuff to do. And I was convinced that before the night was out, they were going to find that what we had planned to do on the next morning was illegal, which would have had an impact on members, I think. Maybe not very much, but it would have had an impact. And I went home, and I came to the door, and I opened the door, and Ruth was there, and she said to me, how are you doing? And I started to cry. And I can remember the feeling exactly. It was like it was coming at us from every direction, right? The government was 77-2. They passed the legislation. There was no way to stop it. The media was all over us. The labor board was going to say it's illegal. Everything was, there was no way, everywhere you turned, it was awful. And for 5 or 10 minutes, I was inconsolable, and I recovered. And as it turned out, our lawyers found a way to stall the decision on essential services, so it wasn't found to be an illegal work stoppage. And the next morning, you'll remember, there were 15,000 people in the Coliseum at the PNE, and that afternoon, 6,000 or 7,000 on the legislature in Victoria, across the province, in a couple of dozen demonstrations. A huge proportion of our members were at. So you say, how did it feel? It felt okay. It felt what? It felt like this is what we had to deal with until that one moment of despair. And then from that next morning on, it felt better and better every minute, because, as John Chisholmore said, and I stole and used in my speech, Gordon Campbell thought that was a one-day protest, but it really was day one of the protest, and the protest hasn't stopped yet. And that time, as dark as it was for those moments and those weeks, was one of the things on one of the platforms on which we built, as the years went on, the fight has continued, the struggle continues.
Yes, and it was indeed a very significant event, that one day of protest, because other unions, other groups in society were very timid with this new government that had such a huge mandate, 77 to 79 seats, that there was a lot of reluctance to actually challenge them in any way, to take them on. And I think the BCTF, in more ways than one, because the BCTF had done this before and others had done it before, but in that climate, it was a very courageous step for teachers to take, to actually do this kind of a protest. And I think that it was a very emotional period for a whole generation of teachers, because they had sacrificed through the local bargaining in the late 80s, early 90s, and in previous rounds of bargaining, they had sacrificed salary and other things to get these provisions in the collective agreement, because it was so important to them and their classrooms and their students and their work lives, that when they saw it erased and rubbed out as it was, it was traumatic and very, very emotional.
And you make a really important point, and it's a point that we in the Federation should always remember, and that is that it's precisely because what was taken away had to do with the work that we do. And the work that we do is to help every kid, every child be the best that they can be. That's what people saw having been taken away. It's one thing when something that's yours is taken away, or that should be yours is taken away, and and it can be unjust. What happened to the Hospital Employees Union? Jobs were stolen and money was stolen from them. But in this case, it was, and people underestimated, and it's taken a long time, and all the way through from the class size organizing that was done in the early 70s, all the way through. And I think that people in British Columbia came to understand that at the end of the day, what teachers were on about in 2002 and later in 2007 and then again later in Jim Eicher's time, what teachers were on about was kids. And it strikes me that if you think about these eruptions that we've had, the two so-called illegal strikes, the one day in 2002, the government and the various other actions that we've taken. Every time that there's an explosion like this between the government and the teachers, the government is always convinced that they will prevail, that they will be able to paint the teachers as selfish and irresponsible. And each time, at the end of the day, when the people of the province are kind of asked, are you with the government or are you with the teachers? Every time they choose the teachers. And why is that? It's because they've been convinced by those very teachers that what this is about is, and it's very, very important.
And it's amazing how difficult it is for governments, for politicians generally, to understand that. But it's true. You're absolutely right.